There's something quietly fascinating about people who grew up in the 1970s, not in a nostalgic, everything was better back then kind of way, but in a psychological one. If you grew up during that era, your mind formed inside a very unusual window in human history, a time with immense freedom, real responsibility, and almost no supervision by modern standards, no constant tracking, no digital leash, no algorithm shaping your attention from childhood. And what's interesting is this: many people from that generation look at today's world and smile. Sometimes they laugh, not out of arrogance, not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. They know something that's hard to explain unless you lived it. They experienced a way of growing up that can't be recreated, a childhood where time stretched endlessly, where boredom wasn't feared, where danger wasn't theoretical, where learning happened through action, not instruction. That's why you still hear them say things like, "We had no idea how good we had it," or "I'd go back in a heartbeat," or the line that's become almost symbolic now, "We drank from the hose, we disappeared all day, we were feral, and it was glorious." So what actually made that era different? And more importantly, what did it do to the brain that still shows up decades later? Let's start with the first trait. Psychologists now call it self-directed problem solving. But back then, it wasn't a theory, it was just life. Every 70s kid remembers some version of this sentence: "Go find something to do." Or worse, "If you say you're bored again, I'll find something for you to do." You knew exactly what that meant. Boredom wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was a warning sign, a signal that you needed to figure something out, fast. So you learned to create your own world. You made up games with no rules. You built things out of nothing. You wandered until something interesting happened. You read books not because they were assigned, but because they were an escape. And here's the part modern psychology confirms. Studies on unstructured childhood play show that kids who weren't constantly entertained developed stronger executive function, deeper creativity, and better long-term focus. Why? Because they had to generate meaning from emptiness. No one scheduled their joy. No one optimized their time. No one told them what mattered. They had to decide. And that shaped the brain in a powerful way. When you learn early how to create purpose without external input, you don't panic when life goes quiet later on. Silence doesn't scare you. Empty space doesn't feel threatening. You know how to fill it. That's why many people from that generation can sit alone without discomfort. They don't need constant stimulation. They don't need noise to feel alive. Their minds learned how to move on their own. But that only explains creativity. It doesn't explain something else people notice immediately: the calm, the almost unsettling calm in chaotic situations. That comes from the second trait: adaptive risk calibration. You didn't grow up protected from danger. You grew up learning how to dance with it. You climbed trees that were too tall. You rode bikes without helmets. You played near roads. You handled tools too young. You got hurt, and then you got up. Every scraped knee, every bad fall, every close call. Your nervous system was being trained. Modern developmental psychology shows that children who experience manageable physical risk develop better threat assessment as adults. They're less anxious, less reactive, less prone to panic. Why? Because they've already lived through fear and survived it. Your body learned the difference between real danger and discomfort. That distinction matters. Today, many people live in a constant state of alert because their nervous systems never learned that lesson firsthand. Everything feels urgent, everything feels dangerous, but yours learned through experience. You don't overreact because you've already tested reality. You don't catastrophize because you've already fallen and lived. Your brain knows something quietly powerful. Most things aren't fatal. Most problems pass. Most fear is exaggerated. And that understanding sits deep in the body, not just the mind, which brings us to the next layer, one that's harder to talk about today, because it goes against modern instincts, but it shaped you in ways people still feel. And that's where we'll go next. You broke bones, you collected scars, and somehow those injuries didn't feel like trauma. They felt like stories. Each mark carried proof that you had tested yourself against the world and survived. That's why even now, when things fall apart, you don't freeze, you don't spiral, you step forward. While others panic, you start asking practical questions. What needs fixing? What matters right now? Your nervous system isn't shocked by chaos, it recognizes it, because chaos was part of your education. But here's where it gets deeper, and this is the part many younger generations struggle to understand. You carry something researchers now describe as comfortable solitude capacity. You learned how to be alone without feeling abandoned. You spent long stretches in your room listening to music, staring at album covers, replaying the same song until it meant something new. You lay in the grass with friends, talking about nothing in particular. You wandered by yourself, not because you were lonely, but because solitude was normal. There was no screen pulling at your attention every few seconds, no notifications demanding an emotional response, no invisible audience watching what you did with your time. And psychology backs this up. Studies on pre-digital childhood show that people who grew up without constant connectivity experience significantly less anxiety when left alone with their thoughts. In one modern experiment, participants were asked to sit quietly for 15 minutes with no distractions. A surprising number chose to give themselves mild electric shocks instead. That probably sounds absurd to you, because you learned early that boredom isn't an emergency. When nothing happened, you didn't panic. You waited, you drifted, you thought. Your mind learned how to entertain itself without external input, and that shaped your brain in a way that's hard to reverse. You never developed the deep addiction to stimulation that defines modern life. Silence doesn't feel threatening. Waiting doesn't feel unbearable. That's why you can stand in long lines without losing your mind. Why you don't feel the constant urge to check something, scroll something, refresh something. Your attention isn't fractured. And that leads us to the next trait. Psychologists often call it analog patience, but really it was just how life worked. You waited for things. You waited a full week for your favorite show. If you missed it, you missed it. There was no catching up later. That made it matter. You took photos and waited days, sometimes weeks, to find out if they turned out. Anticipation was part of the experience. If you wanted to talk to someone, you memorized their phone number, called the house, and hoped they were home. Sometimes a parent answered, sometimes no one did. You tried again later. Nothing was instant, and research on delayed gratification is clear. People who grow up in environments where waiting is unavoidable tend to develop better impulse control, more stable relationships, and stronger long-term career outcomes. Why? Because patience isn't a moral virtue. It's a neurological skill. Your entire childhood trained it. You learned that wanting something didn't mean getting it immediately. You learned that frustration wasn't fatal. You learned that good things often arrived slowly or not at all. That's why instant gratification rarely satisfies you now. It feels shallow, empty, over too quickly. You're not impressed by speed alone, you care about depth. And all of this connects to a final, often overlooked trait, the one that quietly shaped everything else. What I call unsupervised autonomy wiring. By today's standards, it sounds almost unbelievable. At 8 or 9 years old, you left the house in the morning. Your parents didn't track you, they didn't text you, they didn't know exactly where you were. The rule was simple: be back before the streetlights came on. That was it. No maps, no GPS, no check-ins, and somehow it worked. You learned how to navigate the world without constant oversight. You negotiated with other kids, you handled conflicts, you solved problems without adult intervention. Sometimes you made mistakes, sometimes things went wrong, but that was the point. Psychologically, this kind of autonomy builds something incredibly rare today: internal authority. You didn't grow up waiting for permission to act. You didn't assume someone else would step in and fix things. You learned early that your choices mattered and that consequences were real. That changes how you move through life. You don't need constant validation. You don't wait for instructions. You trust your judgment because you've been using it since childhood. And when people from your generation look at the modern world with its endless supervision, constant alerts and emotional overmanagement, they don't feel superior. They feel puzzled because they remember a time when life wasn't safer, but people were stronger. And that difference still lives in the brain. Nobody tracked your location, no apps, no live pins, no constant "where are you" messages. You rode your bike to creeks a mile out of town. You disappeared into the woods. You crossed neighborhoods that weren't technically yours. You explored places simply because they were there. And sometimes, this part shocks people now, a complete stranger might offer you lemonade or sandwiches after you'd been playing in a creek all day. No one panicked. No one called the police. It was just normal. Today, that same situation would trigger fear, suspicion, and emergency calls. But back then, it was part of the social fabric. Adults assumed children were capable. Children were expected to act accordingly. And psychology has something important to say about that. Research on childhood independence shows that kids who had freedom of movement without constant supervision developed stronger internal motivation and sharper decision-making skills later in life. Why? Because you had to assess situations on your own. Is this safe enough? Is this a good idea? What happens if I do this? There was no adult stepping in immediately to decide for you. No buffer between action and consequence. You learned judgment the hard way, and that kind of learning sticks. You weren't protected from consequences. You were introduced to them early, in manageable doses. That trained your brain to think ahead, weigh risk, and take responsibility for outcomes. Your parents weren't your friends. They were the authority. And that mattered. They didn't negotiate every rule. They didn't explain every decision. They trusted you to be competent and expected you to rise to that trust. That combination is powerful. Authority without micromanagement creates responsibility. Freedom without constant rescue creates confidence. And this is why, even now, you can plan without being told how. You can adapt when conditions change. You can think critically without needing step-by-step guidance. You don't shut down when structure disappears because you grew up inside open space. That's also why at times today's world can feel off, too loud, too managed, too fragile. When you watch people panic over minor discomforts, obsess over safety to the point of paralysis, or outsource every decision to systems and experts, something inside you quietly resists. Not because you're stubborn, because your nervous system was shaped differently. And here's the part that matters. When you feel out of place in the modern world, it's easy to assume something's wrong with you, that you're outdated, that you didn't keep up. But that's not what's happening. You're not obsolete. You're carrying forward abilities that are slowly disappearing. The independence that looks like emotional distance, that's competence. The comfort with silence that gets mistaken for antisocial behavior, that's depth. The ability to wait without complaint, something people now label as apathy, that's discipline. You don't need constant stimulation because your mind already knows how to stand on its own. You don't need constant reassurance because you learned early that uncertainty is survivable. You don't confuse discomfort with danger because your body learned the difference decades ago. And here's the quiet truth most people won't say out loud. You survived a childhood that would get parents arrested today, and it didn't break you, it built you. It gave you resilience without fragility, confidence without entitlement, independence without isolation. That's why so many people from your generation say things like, "I feel honored to have grown up that way," or "We lived through the best time to be a kid," not because it was perfect, but because it was real. It demanded something from you and trusted you to give it. And those demands left a mark far deeper than nostalgia. They shaped the way you think, the way you handle pressure, the way you move through life when no one's watching. And there's one final piece to all of this, one insight that ties everything together and explains why this difference still matters now. And they're right. For a brief moment in human history, childhood existed in a rare balance. It was free but not empty, unstructured but not meaningless, dangerous enough to teach lessons yet safe enough to survive. It was a time when kids were both civilized and feral at the same time. You learned manners at the dinner table, then disappeared barefoot into the world for hours. You respected authority, but you also learned how to operate without it. You weren't raised inside a bubble, but you weren't abandoned either. That balance is what made the era formative in a way that's hard to explain now. Because formation doesn't come from comfort alone. It comes from friction. It comes from moments where you have to decide who you are without guidance, from boredom that forces creativity, from freedom that demands responsibility, from risk that teaches restraint instead of fear. That version of childhood doesn't exist anymore, not because people don't care, but because the world changed faster than our understanding of development. Fear replaced trust. Monitoring replaced mentoring. Entertainment replaced exploration. And something subtle but important was lost. You can see it in the way people struggle to sit still, in the way silence feels unbearable, in the way discomfort is treated as a crisis instead of a signal. But if you grew up when you did, your system remembers something else. You remember that life doesn't need constant management to be meaningful. You remember that struggle doesn't automatically mean damage. You remember that freedom, when paired with expectation, creates strength. That's why even today, you don't fully fit into the rhythm of the modern world. You don't rush the way others do. You don't panic at uncertainty. You don't define yourself by constant output or visibility. You can be still without feeling lost. And that isn't because you're behind, it's because you were trained differently. Your brain was shaped in a time when attention wasn't constantly fragmented, when identity wasn't performed, when resilience wasn't outsourced to systems or experts. You learned to rely on yourself, not in an isolated way, but in a grounded one. And that grounding shows up everywhere, in how you approach problems, in how you handle stress, in how you relate to people without needing constant affirmation. You don't need to announce who you are. You already know. This is why so many people from your generation feel a quiet pride when they look back. Not nostalgia, not arrogance, recognition, a sense that something rare happened and that you were lucky enough to live inside it. You didn't just grow up in a decade, you grew up through a developmental window that may never open again. That doesn't make you better than anyone else, but it does mean you carry something forward that the world still needs. Patience in a culture of immediacy, depth in a culture of noise, competence in a culture of supervision. So when you feel out of place, don't rush to correct yourself. You're not malfunctioning, you're remembering. And that memory isn't about the past. It's about what humans are capable of when they're trusted early, challenged realistically, and left alone just enough to become themselves. If you're a 70s kid and this resonates, drop a comment. Say where you grew up. Say what you remember most. Say whether you believe it really was the best era to be a kid. And if you enjoy research-based content like this, content that doesn't dismiss your experience but explains it, hit subscribe. Because this isn't just about nostalgia, it's about understanding who you are and why it still matters. We're just getting started.